Hey everyone, we'll get started in just 1 minute. Alrighty, good morning, everyone. I am going to put in the chat box the sign-in form. So it's important that you sign in for attendance through this form. So that is in the chat box right now. So welcome. Thank you for coming to the 2023 NOFO project applicant training. You are here because you intend to apply for a COC program, whether that be renewal or that be a new project. So thank you for being here. We will go ahead and just jump in. We have a ton of information to throw at you today. Please know that slides will be sent out. That's why we're asking for your email address. I do want to make sure everybody does know that you're being recorded right now. And we do that so that after this, we can send it out to everybody. We know that some folks learn better that way. So again, make sure you're signing in, and that is in the chat box, and I'll throw it in here in just a little bit again for those of you that just jumped on, and then you are being recorded. Okay, so our roadmap today. So what are we going to be talking about? First, we're going to be talking about the COC overview. So what is a COC and all of that fun stuff. Then we'll talk about priorities, so HUD priorities and our local priorities. We will then talk about grantee expectations. So if you're awarded or if you're operating one of these programs, what that means, what are your expectations? Then we'll be talking about housing first, promoting equity, the NOFO process, that's going to be at the end, and that's going to be, I know a lot of you, that's going to be the part that you're like, yes, I need to pay attention to that part, and it is at the end, so make sure we're drinking our coffee and staying awake. And then technical assistance, how we can help you with all of those things, and then we have a ton of resources for you, just to make sure, during this process, it's as streamlined as it possibly can be. As Marquet has said, it's important that you stay till the end. We will be checking at the end just to make sure people did stay on, because this is a mandatory training and there's so much information that we have to make sure that you get. And really quickly, I'm going to go ahead and throw in the chat one more time the sign-in sheet. Okay, so let's get started. My name, I forgot to do this yesterday. My name is Kaylee Coulter. My pronouns are she, her. I am the Coordinated Entry System Manager here at the Homeless Coalition. And then we'll go into what my agency, what our role is in all of this here soon. Okay, so what is a COC? If you could throw in the chat for me really quickly, if you know what a COC is, you put a thumbs up, put a yes, something like that, so I can kind of get a pulse check on where everybody is. I see a thumbs up. Thank you so much, Miriam. Looking in here. Yay, we have people that are familiar. That's wonderful. Okay, I'm going to go over it just really quickly. So a COC, you hear a lot of folks talk about, my agency, GKCCEH, as the COC. That is actually incorrect. So the COC is all of us on the call, all of us that are in the fight to end homelessness, that have come together and committed that that's what our goal is. So I'll read these to you. So it's a group organized to carry out the responsibilities prescribed in the COC program interim rule for a defined geographic area. So we'll go over the COC interim rule here shortly, as well as our geographic area. It's a coordinated and collaborative system to organize and deliver housing and services to meet the specific needs of people experiencing homelessness. And like I said before, it's a community-wide commitment to partnership, shared goals, measurements of success, and the strategic use of resources. Just to kind of visualize this for everybody, once again, it's not one entity, it's all of us. It's the ecosystem, the homeless system ecosystem that makes up all of this. We know that doing this by ourselves, just one agency here, one agency there, it makes it harder. And to come together and really show that we're committed to this and streamlining those resources is what a COC is all about. So what's the goal? So the goal of the COC program, I guess I want to kind of differentiate this. When we talk about COCs, there's kind of two definitions here. You got the COC as an entity, and then you have the COC program. So the COC program is what HUD funds. So when we talk about, you're operating a COC funded program, that's what we mean. It's a COC program that HUD is funding through this COC program. I just said program a lot of times. I know that was confusing. Okay, so it's to improve coordination and integration with mainstream resources and other programs targeted for people that are experiencing homelessness. One of the biggest goals is to collect data and look at, how are we performing, setting performance metrics in place. And it allows each community to tailor its program to its particular strengths and challenges within the community. So if you were to look at our COC side by side with another COC, we may be operating different, and that's okay. So HUD recognizes that every COC is different, whether it be, maybe it's the climate, maybe it's the population we're serving looks different. So HUD does allow for flexibility there, which is very nice. I want to take a second. You'll notice where it says the 604 is a unique COC, la da 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 da. I don't know. I'm guessing Nurse KK probably is not on the call. Nurse KK, I see a Caribbean on the Boulevard person. I hope it's her. She started saying the COC, and we all really enjoy it. There you are. We all really enjoy
604. It's the 604.
Yes, sorry, I keep saying the COC because that's where my mind is. Thank you.
Yeah.
So you started saying the 604, and I know our staff really enjoyed that because we were like, HUD says we're MO 604, but as it says here, we straddle two state lines. So we encompass Kansas as well. And HUD gives us that identifier as MO 604 because the MO side is bigger. But we want to make sure we're inclusive of the Wyandotte County side as well. So this really just kind of sends a message that we're all one. We're not just Missouri. So if you could help us with that paradigm shift in the community and start calling it the 604, we would really appreciate that. And thank you, Nurse KK. So yes, we straddle two states, and we're one of 3 in the nation that does that. Obviously, that presents some challenges. For example, I'm sure most of you on the call know about House Bill 1606, where it's criminalizing people that are experiencing homelessness outdoors. it unfortunately got passed over here in Missouri, and luckily it did not get passed. It was obviously titled something else in Kansas, but advocates were able to shut that down very quickly in Kansas. That just means for the people we're serving, it looks different. You have one side of the state line where homelessness is essentially being criminalized, and one side of the state line where it's not so much. It's not in writing, right? And so things look different. That's just one example. So we, my agency, Greater Kansas City Coalition to End Homelessness, we are the COC lead agency and collaborative applicant for Jackson and Wyandotte counties. What does that mean? So the definition of a COC lead agency and collaborative applicant. So this is very high level, obviously, but it's an agency that is designated by the COC, so by all of you, the members of the COC, to carry out the activities of the COC. That can mean a lot of different things, so we just bulleted some things for you. So obviously what we're doing right now, we're doing the management of the annual HUD application. So when we talk about the collaborative application, that's the HUD application we're talking about. Markea, after a while, will go through the different types of applications, what all has to be submitted to HUD. But the big collaborative application is something that we're responsible for. We think it's really important that it's not just our voices, especially coming from an administrative perspective, but also the voices of the people that are doing the work. So you'll notice that we may be reaching out to you, say for instance, the victim service providers. A lot of times there's questions around domestic violence bonus dollars, and we'll get into that too. And, you know, we don't want to speak to that because that's not our realm, that's not our expertise. And so we'll reach out to the victim service providers to help us answer those questions. So if that applies to you and we reach out, you're like, why are you asking me this? That is why. We just think it's really important that we hear from all of you, and that application that we submit to HUD is inclusive of all of us. Coordination of other funding opportunities. One example of this is whenever COVID-19 came through with all of the money it came with, which was wonderful, but we were like, this is a lot of stinking money. What do we do with it? So basically we were able to get a bunch of the stakeholders on a call and say, you know, how are we going to distribute this money? We were all awarded this pot of money, this pot of money. How do we streamline this? And so that's just one example of how we're trying to streamline some of those mainstream resources. Project and system monitoring. So if awarded with a COC funded project, we are required to go in and monitor your programs annually. And this is not to do a gotcha moment, but this is really to prepare when HUD comes. It's to make sure that we are serving the clients like we say we're going to be serving them. And then meeting management. We have a lot of meetings. So different meetings, once you're funded, you'd be required to go to. And we would go into that afterwards. So that's some of the stuff that we do as a lead agency and a collaborative applicant. We are also the HMIS lead agency, and some COCs you'll see that they are two separate entities. In our COC, we are one entity. And what does that mean? I'm going to keep going on this part, Sade, and then let you guys chime in at the end if that's cool. So the definition of a COC lead agency, so it's an entity again designated by the COC members to operate the HMIS. So that is a homeless management information system. So this is required by HUD that an entity is designated for this. Actually, Sade, your camera's on. Do you want to talk about this part? I know you're going to go deeper into it, but
I can.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So many of you, I was trying to look and see who I was on the call, so I know like how I should talk. But many of you use a system that you have to enter your information in already, and that also may be known as a homeless management information system. There are a number of different ones. So what we are required to do as the HMIS lead is oversee the general management of the HMIS project. So that's the system you enter the information into. And then system administrators. So technically you'll have like one person at your agency that is the go-to person for your case managers. And also if we need something, we can talk to this one person. So they manage the technical aspects of day-to-day operations at HMIS. We develop and conduct document training for HMIS users. We are your help support desk. We analyze the data that you put in there. So you're not just putting it in there for no reason. We're really looking at it, seeing how it affects our system of care, what we need to do with it. We're submitting reports to HUD. We're using it to visualize what programs are needed, how our programs are doing, and then ensure COC reporting requirements. So regardless if you are HUD funded or not, if you put the information in there and we have to submit the report, all of the information is collected and we are the people who upload that information to HUD.
Thank you, Sade. And like I said, the HMIS team, well, I think actually it may just be you, Sade, today. Okay, so Sade will go more in depth with HMIS here in just a little bit. Okay, so the COC interim rule. So I had referenced this at the beginning. So what is it? It's a great read. I'm sure you guys will really want to do it on in your spare time. No, it's actually, it's difficult to read, but it is important. So if you have a COC funded program, if you are awarded, make sure that you print this out or at least bookmark it because it's going to be your baby. So it focuses on regulatory implementation of the COC program. It defines COC responsibilities and promotes best practices. To me, most importantly, it really dives into eligible costs that things you can pay for, depending on the project type that you were funded. So it outlines 6 different project types. So you have permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing, and we're going to go into these, transitional housing, a joint project of transitional to rapid, supportive services only for coordinated entry, homeless management information system, and homelessness prevention. It's super important to note though that transitional housing is no longer funded for new projects, and HP, which is homelessness prevention, is not approved under the COC program in our community. Okay, let's talk about the different categories of homelessness. So HUD outlines homelessness in 4 different categories. The first one is titled literally homeless. So, sorry, I need to stop looking at the chat at the same time. So it's called literally homeless. So this is going to be your most stereotypical homeless living situation. So outdoors, on the streets and cars, emergency shelters. This category does outline, for instance, if somebody is staying in an emergency shelter, or not emergency shelter, a hotel. It outlines, if they're paying for it, they are no longer considered homeless. If a charitable organization is paying for it, they are considered homeless. So it's important that if you come across one of those situations where you're like, I'm not really for sure, that you look into all of the specifications within each category. Category 2 is going to be imminent risk of homelessness. So this is going to be more your homeless prevention. So this is going to be an individual or family who is at risk of losing their housing within 14 days. As we talked about in the last slide, this category is not eligible under the COC program currently. We're focusing on category 1 and 4, and I'll get into that here in just a second. Okay. Category 3, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on just because we are not authorized to serve people under category 3. Essentially what this is they're youth or families with children who do not qualify under HUD's category or HUD's definition of homelessness, but maybe they qualify under other federal statutes of homelessness. It has to be authorized by HUD for us to be able to use this, and we have to be qualified as a high performing community in order to use this. Okay, so 4, this one's super important. We actually have 2 slides on it. So this is going to be your fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence. So generally fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, we think about IPV. Fortunately, HUD has expanded this. So this also includes trafficking, stalking, dating violence is included in here. But it's also expanded, they also expanded on that. So VAWA updated in 2022 and they included this definition. So I'm going to read it to you all because it is important that we understand it. So any individual or family who, number one, is experiencing trauma or a lack of safety related to or fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, or other dangerous, traumatic, or life-threatening conditions related to the violence against the individual or family in the individual or family's current housing situation, including where the health and safety of children are jeopardized. And again, this is the same as the other definition, has no other safe residence and lacks the resources to obtain other safe permanent housing. So this is super important because it expands it. It expands it from, again, just IPV and that one person. Say, for instance, you are a young person and you're staying with your uncle and, you know, traumatic things are happening. You're having to exchange different things to stay there that are not lovely. And so in those situations, if those things are being explained to you, they would qualify under category 4 as well. Okay, I'm going to stop just for a second there. Any questions? Okay, I'm going to keep it moving. Okay, so COC priorities. We're going to start off with HUD's COC program priorities, and then the next slide is going to be our local priorities. So starting with HUD's priorities. Ending homelessness for all persons is a priority of HUD's. Using a housing first approach, which we will go over in more depth here soon. I'm sure some of you on the call have heard housing first. We really want to get a great understanding of what housing first is for you. Reducing unsheltered homelessness, improving system performance, partnering with housing, healthcare, and service organizations. We will again go deeper into that piece of it because we really want to hone in on housing as healthcare and how we can really promote that as a community. Next is racial equity. So just making sure that we are centering all things that we do and all of this work around racial equity. Actually, these these next several we'll go deeper into. Improving assistance to LGBTQIA+ individuals, including persons with lived experience from the start. Not just for a checkbox to say that we're doing it, but making sure that we're doing it from the jump. And then increasing affordable housing. So our local priorities. So like I said, Marquea is going to dive deeper into the actual process at the end. But basically, you know, what happens is we get a group together, the rank and review panel, and they're going to be looking for project applicants that are demonstrating these things. So projects which demonstrate the ability to improve system performance as a whole, projects which demonstrate the ability to fill a gap in the current system, projects with flexibility to serve households of any composition. So this one's super important. For example, you know, say we have a family that's super vulnerable. There's 6 kiddos. It's a large family, but the programs that are saying they have openings will only serve individuals. Something like that that's not meeting the needs of what we're seeing out on the streets. That's going to be something that we're thinking of, that the rank and review panel is thinking about when looking at applications. Projects which demonstrate a collaborative effort to improve client outcomes. So projects that are willing to break outside of silos and really come up with collaborative solutions. Projects which serve the entire geography of the COC. So once again, ours is Jackson County and Wyandotte County. And then in addition to the priorities listed above, new rapid rehousing projects with few to no barriers to entry will be prioritized. So for example, if we have a project that's saying, you know, we would be able to be flexible and serve whoever, that would be one that would probably jump off the page at the rank and review panel because it's, you know, flexible, meeting the needs of whatever the need is. So those are our local priorities in addition to HUD's priorities. Okay, so you've heard me talk a little bit about different types of projects. We're going to dive into project types. Full transparency, I haven't presented on this part yet, so I'm going to do my best and have my team jump in if I mess anything up. Okay, so first and foremost, we have our permanent supportive housing. So permanent housing with indefinite leasing or rental assistance paired with supportive services to assist homeless persons with a disability, with an adult having a disability, or yes. And then PSH is prioritized or dedicated to serve chronically homeless households. So if you have this type of project, eligible costs of PSH, and you'll hear us say PSH, we're talking about permanent supportive housing, leasing or rental assistance, operating costs, supportive services, HMIS cost, and administration costs. It's important to note that PSH can be tenant-based or project-based. This does require that the client pays up to 30% of their adjusted gross income. And the lease should be between the agency and the landlord. So that part's important to note too, because there's going to be a change in that with some of the other programs. Okay, so dedicated plus projects, I'm not going to read off the page here, but essentially it's a type of permanent supportive housing project. It's just much more flexible on who can enter the project. So like I said, we are going to send out these slides to everybody. I would really encourage you to look, if you're operating a PSH program, to really look into this. And if you're not classified as a dedicated plus project, I really urge you to think about doing so. One of my biggest reasons, for a lot of reasons, but one of my biggest reasons, I just went to the next slide. Number 4, it says these are people that can be entered into this project, a dedicated plus project. Residing in transitional housing funded by a joint TH to RH component, projects who were experiencing chronic homelessness before going into that project. So we have projects within our COC that are the joint TH to RH program. And for example, I'm trying to put this that makes sense to everybody. If somebody goes into that TH portion, they lose their chronicity, unfortunately, and therefore are not eligible for a transfer if and when they would need to be transferred. Say, for instance, they couldn't achieve self-sustainability at the end of their 2 years in that program. And that program is like, I would like to be able to transfer them to a PSH program if there's an opening. If the PSH program that we have available is not dedicated plus, they cannot transfer. If it is dedicated plus, they can. And so it's just one of those things that as a community, it would be great if all of our PSH programs were flexible in this way. And so that's just a tidbit to be thinking about if you do have a PSH program, to be looking into this. Okay, another project type is rapid rehousing, or RRH. So this emphasizes the housing search and relocation services in short and medium-term rental assistance to move homeless persons and families with or without a disability as rapidly as possible into permanent housing. So this project can offer rental assistance up to 24 months. We have programs or projects that are operating, for example, saying we'll offer a 6 months or a year, and then after that reevaluate, which is great and dandy. But what we want to start seeing is projects that are really able to utilize that 2 years when and if needed, and not being so stringent on those timelines. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Eligible costs of rapid rehousing are rental assistance, supportive services, HMIS, and administration. Again, rapid rehousing may be tenant-based or project-based. Operating costs are not eligible under the rapid rehousing project funds. Rapid rehousing also does not require clients to pay an occupancy rate. If you get this project and you're funded this project and you decide that clients should be paying 30%, that has to be in your policy and procedures internally and applied across the board to all clients in your project. In this, the difference is the leases between the client and the landlord, and case management services are a requirement. Okay, so the joint transitional to rapid or joint TH to RH is similar to rapid rehousing, except it adds in that transitional piece. So same thing as far as time frame, they would have the 2 years in that program if needed. In that time frame, the person should be able to say at any time in those two years that they would like to stay in transitional or be using the rapid rehousing portion. So an example would be if a person utilizes that rapid rehousing portion and they're leased up, something happens, they fall out of that lease, they're evicted, whatever it may be, they should have the ability to then utilize the transitional portion again. So anytime within that 2-year period, they should be able to use one or the other. Let's see. Eligible costs. So rental assistance or leasing, operating only for the transitional component, because again, that's not eligible under the rapid rehousing. Supportive services, HMIS, and administration. Again, TH and RH may be tenant-based or project-based. Okay, before we go on to grantee expectations, any questions? Okay, I'll pass it over to you, Markea.
Hi, thank you. My name is Markea Watson. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the director of the Greater Kansas City Coalition to End Homelessness. So yeah, I'm going to go over the high level expectations of grantees, both from the COC HUD perspective as well as the local perspective. And so in general, as an applicant to the NOFO competition, those who are eligible to apply include nonprofit organizations, state and local governments, and public housing agencies. In addition, as an applicant, you must be committed to involvement in COC committee work, system level planning, and then implementation of any things that we identify that would drive system performance. Locally, we have outlined these expectations so that folks understand kind of what it is that they're getting into. First of which is a memorandum of understanding. This is an applicant MOU that we've created, I believe in the last 3 competitions, to provide clarity around what it is that we're focused on locally in terms of our values and how we approach this work. I'll go a little bit more in depth into the rationale for the MOU in just a sec. The COC interim rule, as Kaylee referenced, it's really critical that you take the time to read, annotate, highlight, really fully understand this document. It is the federal legislation that governs all of the things that we're doing as a continuum of care. There have been many instances where I've gone out to agencies to monitor or for a visit, and folks don't know what I'm talking about when I reference the interim rule, and that frightens me because you're on the hook as grantees for a lot of money. And so just like you need to know the local rules of the road in order to have a driver's license, you should also know the rules that govern the program that you're operating. The 25% match requirement, this is a 25% cash or in-kind commitment for all COC funds awarded, excluding those awarded for leasing dollars. We'll discuss this a little bit more in depth as well later on. Capacity to administer the project. So I think this is a really important one, especially in the wake of the pandemic situation, recognizing that, we want you all to be aspirational about what you'd like to do, but also practical about what you can do in terms of staffing infrastructure and resources, housing infrastructure and resources, and financial resources. Participation in the use of HMIS is a mandate of all COC awardees as well as ESG awardees, by the way, some of you are both. This is non-negotiable except for organizations that serve individuals that are experiencing or fleeing or attempting to flee interpersonal violence. So please don't make the HMIS an afterthought, or please don't contact staff when, you know, it's time for you to report and, oh snap, I didn't enter any of my clients into HMIS. That would be in the don't do column of grantee expectations. Participation in coordinated entry. If you are a housing provider that is funded by the COC, any and every referral that you get into your program must come from the coordinated entry system with 0 exceptions. I can't imagine an outlier situation where this would be necessary, so just please remember that you have to take your referrals from the system. Community involvement, this means doing work, you know, amongst the COC, but also being involved in the local homeless response and in social services out in the community. This can look, you know, many different ways depending on kind of your swim lane as an organization and the work that you do out in the community. And then annual program monitoring. We have a monitoring guide sheet for you that shows you what it is that we're looking at when we annually come to visit your organizations. This might be in the form of an in-person visit or a desk type of audit. I hate the term audit, but you get the point. This is also non-negotiable. It is a mandate of us that we ensure that grantees have all of the documents that they need to have in place in terms of their organizational and founding documents, that their client level documents are in check, and that they're compliant with the HUD COC interim rule. Annual program monitoring is a requirement of grantees as well as of the collaborative applicant, and so therefore non-negotiable as well. Next slide, please. So the rationale for the MOU. So we wanted to ensure that we kind of level set in terms of what our values as a community should look like, and so that we know that we're all swimming in the same direction and have the same kind of sense of purpose. So accountability and stewardship, I think that it goes without saying, you know, when you're awarded any kind of grantees as a grants as a nonprofit, that you are accountable to the things that you say you're going to do and that you are a good steward of those resources. But this also means being accountable to our clients, to ourselves and each other in terms of those commitments, and being good stewards of this endeavor that we're all on together. It's meant to clarify roles and responsibilities at a high level for both the collaborative applicant and you as agency partners, so you know what you're supposed to do and you know what we're supposed to do. Ensuring that there's continuity and quality of services across programs. So this is kind of, you know, identifying a North Star for, you know, the quality of work, but then also ensuring that if a person goes into agency A, they don't have a dramatically different experience than they do at agency B. So that we all have commonly understood, mutually recognized definitions of things. It's also meant to drive the collaborative work, so identifying opportunities for collaboration, you know, and where those are absolutely mission critical in terms of things like the point in time count. Ensuring that we are equitable in our service delivery, and that, you know, in terms of accountability, that we provide as immediate access to the resources as we can, understanding that, you know, homelessness is an urgent and life-threatening crisis for the person that's having that experience. And so we need to get moving and move swiftly to try to get them to safety. Addressing gaps in the system and barriers to access. So I think that this requires us to be, you know, flexible, to really interrogate our programs, interrogate where we might be doing well, where we might be coming up short, and to the best of our ability to eliminate those barriers to ensure quicker and more ready access for our folks. And then I think the most obvious, and maybe this one should be at the top, centering the person and not the program, in terms of making sure that we are client-centered in all of our approaches, and really, really, truly mindful of that in our work. Next slide. So we outlined our values and principles as such. I think I'm not going to read all of these to you, but I do think that some of these for me really stick out. I think that transparency, equity and inclusion, competence, using data to make our decisions, being client-centered and strengths-based, learning as a cultural practice. This is really important to me personally. As a person who is naturally curious, this is a value that I embody in my life in general, but you need to be curious about this work because homelessness changes. The ground shifts beneath our feet. COVID was a perfect example of that. And being married to ideas that might, be preferred or favored, but maybe aren't the best approach in the current circumstances or operating environment requires us to stretch our brains, just a little bit, but also to be curious and inquisitive about what we might do, piece by piece to fine tune our programs and to better serve our guests in our programs. And then nimble responsiveness and flexibility. Again, sometimes being stuck on the way that we've always done it can prove fatal for people. And so we need to, be compliant with our programs and adhere to what we committed to doing, but then also have enough internal flexibility to shift if what we're doing isn't working. Next slide, please. In addition, it outlays the participation requirements of COC applicants. So like we mentioned before, coming to our committee and work groups, so signing up to those. You can find the list of committees that are currently functioning on our website. Also attending the monthly membership meeting. We are currently developing a structure where we have every other month an in-person hybrid meeting, and then in between we have virtual meetings. We recognize that folks haven't necessarily all come back to the office after COVID, and some people do continue to be at risk health-wise, and COVID-19 is still around us, and so we wanted to make sure that everyone's able to meet, but that happens on a monthly basis, and it's super important that you're there. The coordinated entry process, obviously, as I mentioned before, HMIS data quality. So again, not just phoning it in on HMIS, but really being committed to putting up high quality, comprehensive, timely information into the system. I think, again, when we're doing the work, sometimes we, put our heads down and we're focused on the clients, which is obviously the most important thing. But if you don't put what you did in HMIS with those clients, from the system perspective, it never happened. And so it's important that you're documenting your work in HMIS and that you do that in a clean and crisp kind of way, and that you do it within 72 hours at the most after talking to a person. Participation in the point in time count. This means putting your feet on the street the day of the count, as well as participating in all of the things that are required of grantees for a housing inventory count. So there's two pieces to the point in time count. And we ask that you participate in both. The housing inventory count stuff happens before the day of the count in January. And then obviously we hit the streets and do surveys out in the field those last 10 days in January. Monitoring and program evaluation, as discussed before. And then there are additional post-award requirements. We've started collecting information in Zoom Grants, which is the same platform that applicants use to apply. We recognize that, it's a little bit of a clunky system. Most of the grant application systems are, but it does enable us to, in the same platform, to collect the information as follow-up for your grant applications. Next slide. So coordinated entry. I think the most important aspect of coordinated entry is that we're looking at, a broad spectrum of need in the community and recognizing that unfortunately there's never enough for everybody. And so we have to be as thoughtful and strategic about how we use our housing resources to ensure that the people who are most at risk have access to housing first. Now, and I'm saying housing first in terms of the queue for people that are waiting. It ensures that we as a community are coordinating and getting on the same page about who it is that we're going to prioritize for housing. And we know that it's heartbreaking, and you just feel gutted when you know that you're talking to a person that most likely isn't going to get housed through the system, but we need to be able to identify where those pain points are so that we can find alternative resources and steer people toward other things that might help them, should we be unable to offer them a housing intervention. We focus through coordinated entry on those with the highest needs, those who are most vulnerable in the community, and we try to do that in as equitable and transparent a manner. And it's meant to systematize our process so that people aren't getting skipped over. Coordinated entry was designed because one of the reasons that we have such an outsized chronically homeless population nationwide is because folks were housing the people that were the most likely to present to an organization to seek help, the people that we were already working with and already had relationships with. And so in many instances, people that were easier to identify, easier to find, and easier to serve, to the exclusion of people that have the most health challenges, the most behavioral health and substance misuse challenges, who are experiencing the most, egregious violence on the streets. And unfortunately, we also know that we have a race issue in our homeless system. And so we recognize that Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, as well as those of LGBTQIA experience, were also being missed entirely by the system. And so coordinated entry is a necessary evil. And I know that, folks struggle with it because it requires us to kind of sometimes run around in circles to find folks and so on. But it's critical that we do this in a coordinated way so that we know we're touching the people who wouldn't be touched otherwise. So the process is pretty straightforward on paper. We're identifying here how a person from our first encounter with them works their way through the system. So initially, the screening process, now the screening might happen months or even years sometimes after you first started to engage a person, because sometimes people aren't ready. And, it depends on the individual situation, but we're doing an initial kind of screening triage to figure out what avenues we might pursue to try to get a person into housing. And then we perform an assessment on the individual. This is a standardized assessment that is used across the COC. The information taken from all of that is then utilized to prioritize people into a housing queue. And then once we're able to refer a person to a program and the program has an opening, we make a housing match and then send out a referral. Again, if you take this money, you have to take all of your clients through this process. Another aspect of coordinated entry that is considered a best practice is progressive engagement. So I do want to be clear that coordinated entry does not mean conducting a VI SPDAT assessment. There are a lot of other aspects to coordinated entry. Sometimes there's a lot of conversations that need to be had with a person to ensure that, they're ready to, embark on this journey with us, and that we do have the means to successfully support them. And so progressive engagement means that we work with people from start to finish on their housing journey to ensure that we're not overserving or underserving people, but doing our level best to get them to the type of housing or housing-based supports that are appropriate for their needs. And this can happen backwards, forwards, upside down, left side, right side. Each person is different. The path into homelessness was a circuitous one. And so most likely the path out of homelessness is also going to be a circuitous one. So we need to be flexible, recognizing that each person has different needs and that different strengths and resiliencies, and those things can change over time. Targeted, so that each household's needs are that we're targeting resources to support folks in their needs as a household, and not just kind of slapping, interventions onto people that might not work or might not be wanted or needed. And then efficient. So again, trying to maximize the resources by working with people on this longitudinal path. It's our goal to get them to whatever their off-ramp is, and not just, you have serious mental illness, you go into permanent supportive housing. Just because a person has serious mental illness does not necessarily mean that they need or want that level of support. And so we're trying to connect people in real time to the right resource that suits their needs at that moment. Next slide. Okay, Sade, I'm going to give it back to you.
Hey, I am Shada McCormick, the Data Systems Manager. I think it's important when we're mentioning HMIS that everyone understands that this is not meaning that you'll be able to choose the HMIS system that you'll put your information in. You will have to choose the HMIS system chosen by the COC locally, and right now that is Caseworthy. So if you are already putting your information in, I don't know, like Service Point or MacLink, you will also need to put this information into Caseworthy, and it will be need to be the implementation of the 604's implementation of Caseworthy. So I know Johnson County has the implementation of Caseworthy as well, so we would need to make sure that it is our implementation. So the homeless management information system, like some of the ones I just named, is just a local technology system used to collect client level data for housing and services. So each continuum of care is responsible for selecting the HMIS software. And like I said, ours that we have selected is Caseworthy. Yeah, it's important to note that the high quality level data, so victim services providers, you will also need to report, but that information is put into a comparable database, and we can get more into that. So our HMIS vendor is different than the HMIS lead. So we are the HMIS lead. We are not Caseworthy. So we are there to assist you with how to put your information into Caseworthy and what information should go into Caseworthy. But Caseworthy is not our system. So we help you with the system, but we do not have ownership of the system. So how does the CLC use HMIS data? So we use this to measure agency and system performance. It's important that when you're putting your information in the system, that you understand that this is not only affecting your agency, but this is affecting all agencies in the continuum of care. So that's why we stress very hard on putting your data in a timely manner, making sure that your data quality is up to date, because we are all working. These are all of our clients, was just not your client. So as one agency is working with the same client, we want to make sure that we are assisting this client in the best way possible. So the information should be put in so that you understand we're all working in one system. So report this to state and federal funding purposes. So we have a lot of people who put the information in and they're like, well, I don't receive that funding source. That's fine. But if I'm asked to report on a rapid rehousing projects, and you have a rapid rehousing project, your project is going to encompass in that. So seeing what homelessness looks like from a bird's eye view, we really use this information to drive our decisions, what project types we need, what's working best. When we look at the trajectory of our clients that are getting housed faster, like, are they going from emergency to rapid? Are they doing this? So we use all of this information to be able to look at that. We track our service needs. So we, right now, we're not able to track what we can assist with, but we can track what we are assisting with. So we can see, okay, all of these clients that were housed in state house, they received this service. So maybe we need to fund this service more. So we use it to track demographic information and understand possible gaps in our system. This has been very helpful. Over the past few years, we have cleaned up our data. So we are able now to see most of those gaps of, we were funding this, but we need to be doing this, or this is working, but this is maybe why this isn't working. So now we can use that data so that we can put all of those pieces together to better help you and our clients.
Sade, can I add something in there that Desiree said yesterday that really resonated with me?
Yes.
So Desiree is on the HMIS team as well, and she is our data quality guru. And she said that she was an end user for several years in HMIS, and she all the time she was always into data. So like luckily she had that view of it. But when she came onto our team and realized that the data she was putting in, it can go all the way to Congress, or it can make a lot of influential change if we're putting it in correctly.
Yes.
And yeah, and I know you say this and Desiree says this a lot, but the data is only as good coming out as it is going in. And that sticks with me a lot. And so if you just think about how much impact you can truly have by putting in correct, high quality data. Yeah, anyways, what she said about that yesterday just really spoke volumes to me.
Yeah,
So-
and I have to say this too. So for 4 years, I was the person who cleaned up the data at an agency level. And still, even cleaning up that data, I just wanted to make sure our data was clean. Until I started working here, I did not know the implications of that data, how far up it went, how the data that I was cleaning up was also used to be paired with other agencies and look at the clients like all over Wyandotte and Jackson County. I had no idea. So just understanding that the data that you're putting in is way more than just you reporting on who you assisted that week. Like it goes further than that. So making sure that ethics, you're putting in the data as accurate as possible, as timely as possible. And I just think the most important thing is understanding that the information must go into caseworthy. The caseworthy that for MO 604, I'm gonna have to get used to
I
the 604, but making sure that that is the system. We have that caveat a lot with some people like, well, I put it in my HMIS system, but it has to be a certain HMIS system. So information that is collected in HMIS, I think this is another thing that we find. So they're like, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to choose this system. And I'm going to put in what I want to put in, but you need to make sure that you understand what we're requiring. So all personally identifiable information. So that is name, date of birth, Social Security. With the HUD data standards that update every 2 years, they are changing the way that Social Security is, the way it pulls up on your data quality report. So partial socials will no longer show up as a data quality error. So that's a great thing for organizations that as of right now, they don't collect full social. Race and ethnicity and gender will be collected different ways. They are combining race and ethnicity. I know a lot of times in reporting, we deal with this a lot if someone identifies as Hispanic, but we're also saying, okay, you have to identify as a race and we're trying to report. It's just a lot of things. So that will all be fixed. Additional information that we're required. So we require all HUD assessments. So that's going to be universal, program, financial, and health insurance. So that's going to capture your client's chronically homeless status, any disabilities they may have, income. So you will be required to capture all of this information with taking on these funds and coming into the system. And services and case notes are very optional in our system. We do encourage that you use them. There are tools there for that. It really helps the HMIS team when we're trying to piece things together. If we can go and look at the services or look at the case notes, but those two are completely optional.
So Sade, whenever you get the question after this training and somebody's awarded, what services and case notes do I need to put in for my COC funded program? What will your answer be?
Completely optional.
Perfect. Thank you. Because I know we're still going to get it. Okay. Any questions for any of the content that we've shared so far? Okay. Give me just 1 second because I'm just now realizing that I did not share my sound with you all and we're about to watch a video. All right, I'm going to ask that somebody gives me a thumbs up or thumbs down if you can hear this. And we're going to shift gears into housing first. Just to preface this video really quickly, all COC funded programs. So if you are awarded through the COC program, the program that you operate has to abide by the housing first philosophy. So what you're about to watch is what housing first is and what you would need to run your program as. So again, thumbs up or thumbs down if you can't hear this.
Housing First has 5 key principles. If you're not following the 5 principles, it's not Housing First. Principle number 1, immediate access to housing with no housing readiness conditions. Participants meet with a support team once per week, but housing is not dependent on psychiatric treatment, abstinence, or other readiness conditions. And when we say no housing readiness conditions, we mean none. Now, many participants stay housed in their first rental, but evictions happen. With the support team's help, it's an opportunity for learning, adjusting, and the immediate chance to try again. Research shows Housing First reduces emergency room visits, hospitalization, shelter use, detox services, and incarceration. There are no common indicators that predict who Housing First will and won't work for. So given its effectiveness, let's focus on Housing First, then let participants tell us the next step. Principle number 2, consumer choice and self-determination. This principle highlights that participants want and can make productive change occur in their lives. But in order to thrive, meaningful housing options are a necessity, and research shows that a majority of participants prefer independent market housing throughout the city. Now, in order to foster learning and self-determination, it's important that the team support most choices participants make. Though the team can point out expectations, they should avoid overprotecting participants from learning opportunities. When choices have poor outcomes, a supported learning environment promotes more informed choices in the future, reducing long-term harm and increasing self-sustainability. Principle number 3, recovery orientation. People are more likely to do well and achieve personal goals when they have an opportunity to find their own recovery. Housing First relies on supporting people as they work at their pace towards self-defined goals, whether it's treatment, returning to work, or reconnecting with family. The addition of peer workers on the support team addresses power dynamics, increases safety, and models hope for both participants and team members. Finally, by building, following, and reviewing strength-based recovery plans, the support team can spend less time managing crisis and more time on the steps that lead to the participants' goals for recovery. Principle number 4, individualized and person-driven supports. Now, support is meant to fit the participant, not the other way around. People are at the center of Housing First. Therefore, the support team provides appropriate team members, approach, and tools that help each individual with their goals. Whether that's grocery shopping, working, adopting a pet, finances, therapy, or engaging with new communities. By replacing complicated policies with flexible models and a can-do philosophy, the team helps participants reduce long-standing systemic barriers, thereby improving self-determination, choice, and quality of life. Principle number 5, social and community integration. Moving to a new area can be a hard experience for anyone and can make you feel pretty isolated and lonely. The Housing First team can help participants build community connections based on their specific needs and interests. The team also fosters community development by providing landlords and community members with education on Housing First, inclusion, and myth-busting negative stereotypes. And though supporting social and community integration may take time, it can go a long way in helping participants establish relationships and support networks within new communities.
Okay, so Housing First, I like to put that video in there because they say it much more eloquently than I do. But Housing First, it's the idea that you're moving away from housing as a reward to housing as a human right. It's a foundation and should be treated as a catalyst to the behavioral change that we're wanting to see, or just any change that we're wanting to see. We know that without getting our basic needs met, it's hard to address anything else, right? Housing First also says that there's no prerequisites to getting into housing. So we cannot and should not be saying, they need to get into treatment before they can get housing. They need to get a job before they can get housing, any of those things. And, if you put yourself in the shoes of somebody that is living outdoors, all of those things are so difficult when you don't have a place to wash up or you don't have a place to lay your head. So looking at it from that lens is really helpful. I think a big part of this is self-determination, and the client's choice in all of this. My supervisor had once said to a client, and I've inherited this because I really like it, that, when you're talking with a client, that client is the driver and I'm the passenger. And, as they're driving, if I need to get the map out and try to figure out which way we're going, that's fine. But just to kind of visualize for that person that I'm not driving this boat for you. You're the one driving it, and I should be treated as a tool, or just, you know, a soundboard, whatever. Another thing that I see a lot of times, and I enjoy that component 5 around the social and the community, is, let's say, for instance, you have somebody you're working with, and we're viewing it as, you know, they don't want the unit that I offered them. They're saying all of these things have to be in place before they're going to be housed in this area or whatever. And then we label the person as picky or whatever it may be. And to me, it's really getting down to the nitty gritty and asking more questions. And Kristen Olson's on the call, and I like when she says, you know, if you're not getting the answers that you want, you're not asking the right questions. And so maybe, you know, maybe we're viewing it as this person's being picky or whatever it may be, but maybe it is because of their identity. They can't live in that area and be safe, whether that's physical safety or psychological safety. There's always a reason for why somebody is operating the way they're operating. It's just asking the right questions. Next slide. Housing first, core elements. Thank you, Kristen. Yes, I love that. So it's focusing on helping individuals access and sustain permanent rental housing as quickly as possible. And so once again, taking out those prerequisites to getting into housing already is helping that person get in, get a foundation, and then we can start peeling back those layers of the onion to start figuring some of the other stuff out. Provide services to promote housing stability and individual well-being on an as-needed basis. This is the part that I personally get very frustrated whenever people say housing first does not work, because housing first is not housing only, and we'll say it 1,000 times. It requires that services are in place. Housing first does not work without services. Like I think know that. I think all of us has probably tried it and it doesn't work. We have to have wraparound services, or else we're telling people that they're failing whenever it's truly our failure. And so remember, services is actually the biggest piece to this. A standard lease agreement to housing as opposed to mandated services compliance, which we've talked about. I'm going to read this quote to you because it spoke volumes to me, and I just really want it to resonate and let it sink in as I read it. So the traditional structures to help, I'm sorry, let me start over. The traditional structures in place to help, quote unquote, the homeless population often make things worse, particularly for those who suffer from mental illness. Shelters and transitional living programs often require people to pass sobriety tests and other hurdles before they can be considered for housing programs. Housing is considered a reward for good behavior instead of a tool to help stabilize a homeless person's mental health. This attitude cuts out the people who need the support the most, effectively punishing them for their conditions. And I couldn't put it in better words. And so whenever my supervisor, Amber, had found this, I was like, yeah, we got to put it in there because it speaks volumes. The picture goes right along with it. It shows how we have viewed getting people off the streets before Housing First was implemented. So, you know, we're requiring all of these things to get into permanent housing. And the soapbox I'll get on, which is just, it's quite crazy to me that we're requiring all of those things before literally putting somebody in 4 walls and a roof, right? So it's very crazy to me that you strip people almost of their, you know, themselves as a human and say you have to do all of these things whenever, you know, if we were in that same situation, we wouldn't want to be expected of the same thing. And so just think about it in that way. And I'm an advocate for Housing First. I know it works. And so I ask that for any of the critics on the call, because there's always critics, that we do a deeper dive into what actually is Housing First. Let's look at it from a fidelity lens. Let me go. Oh, so that's it for Housing First, actually. I thought there was one more slide. What we're going to do now is we're going to take a 10-minute break before we shift gears just a little bit. So use the restroom, get a snack, stretch, and we will come back at 10:20. See you guys then. Alrighty, folks, we are going to get started again. We're gonna start this session off with promoting equity. And Miss Evie Duffy is going to be talking about racial equity with us.
Hi, everyone. My name is Evie Duffy. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm with Community Services League. I am the VP of Housing Services. I want to give a shout out and credit to John Trammell, who helped me put together some of this information. He couldn't be here today to help present, but he did do some of the work, so wanted everyone to know that. Racial equity continues to be a priority for HUD. And I think that if we are doing our work well, it should certainly be a continued priority for each of our agencies. To live in this country really is to see examples of racial inequity everywhere. And to do this work is to walk alongside those who are most impacted by some of those disparities. So when we last did this training, this section was sort of like intended to be an overview and sort of a first step into a community-wide deeper dive. And unfortunately, that hasn't happened yet, but I hope that each individual agency has begun the work. For today, we'll sort of revisit that overview and hope that you feel inspired or sort of like reignited to start thinking about this topic as something more than a question to be answered on the NOFO for points or a box to check or whatever. I do still hope that in the coming year, couple years, however, we can figure out how to really approach this collaboratively as a community. But we don't have that kind of time today. So like I said, we're just sort of going to revisit that overview. I really hope that a lot of this information feels familiar to you. And if it doesn't, I would encourage you to ask yourself why. Maybe what has kept you or your agency from engaging in these sorts of conversations around racial equity. And however you come to this information, I hope that your takeaway today is, what does this mean for me and my agency and the way that we're running our programs? So this slide is really just a summary of some of the language used in this year's NOFO. And we'll sort of revisit and expand on some of this in later slides, but this just says, in nearly every community, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color are substantially overrepresented in the homeless population. HUD is emphasizing system and program changes to address racial equity within COCs. COCs should review local policies, procedures, and processes to determine where and how to address racial disparities affecting individuals and families experiencing homelessness. This slide is just a screenshot of HUD's racial equity tool, which spits out some data from the 2021 PIT count. So you can see here that at 22% of the population in our COC, Black people are overrepresented in each of these categories. I think that if you've been doing this work for a minute, you've certainly seen this just with your own eyes. And I also think that you have probably also seen, just sort of like anecdotally, how Black men in particular are really living and dying on the streets at a higher rate than their white counterparts. So just an interesting little snippet from that tool from HUD. In terms of causes of disparities, we know that racism is not just about prejudice, right? It's about institutional power. It is about a power imbalance that favors white people. And that has been intentionally woven into the fabric of the system that we're all working and living and operating in. So below are some sort of sections, I guess, where we'll talk about some examples of policies and practices that contribute to racial disparities in each of these categories. So in education, a sort of more obvious example, I guess, of racial inequity is just the history of school segregation. But I don't know that we can really think about that as fully being history in the past tense. The sort of modern day workaround to just straight up segregation is just really racially concentrated districts. So a district where over 75% of the students in that district are of the same race, be that like white or non-white. And then along with that goes a really clear sort of pattern of discrepancy in how funds are distributed between predominantly white and predominantly non-white districts. And then I think in education, we also have maybe not as historical or obvious examples. So in 2017, here in Kansas City, KCUR did a study of like discipline and suspensions in schools and found that the 40% of the student population is Black, and they made up 74% of suspensions, meaning that Black kids were 5 times more likely to be suspended and to receive longer suspensions. I think it goes without saying that that affects the lower high school graduation rates among Black students and students of color. So in housing, I found some statistics that were kind of striking to me about home ownership. In 2022, the home ownership rate for white households is 75% compared to 45% for Black households and 48% for Hispanic households. So it's really shockingly different percentages there. Redlining is a perfect example of very intentionally inequitable policies put into place, especially here in Kansas City. I hope that we're all familiar with redlining here, considering the work that we're doing. If you aren't familiar, I encourage you to go out and do some research. It's been a topic that's been talked about in a lot of spaces in the last couple of years, and there's a lot of good information out there. So you should really familiarize yourself with that, because the impacts of redlining are still super prevalent in our neighborhoods today. And then my last note on disparities in housing is really just around the much higher rates of discrimination that Black, Indigenous, and people of color face from landlords when they're trying to rent. I think a lot of us have probably seen that when we're working with clients who have been evicted or clients who we're helping to lease up. I'm wondering how many of us feel like we are comfortable and equipped to have those tough conversations with landlords when we can see that they're blatantly being discriminated against based upon their race. In terms of healthcare, the CDC really just has a bunch of information about how racial and ethnic minority groups throughout the US experience way higher rates of illness and death across a whole host of like manageable conditions, right? Like diabetes, hypertension, obesity, asthma, heart disease, that sort of thing. They have also found that life expectancy for Black Americans and people of color is 4 years less than white Americans. And then COVID-19, obviously, I think we all saw through COVID-19 how disproportionately impacted racial and ethnic minority groups were during that time. And then in terms of healthcare, I think there's also just numerous studies about how significantly different the healthcare experience is for Black and Indigenous people and people of color. They are much less likely to be admitted to the hospital from the ER. They're much less likely to have pain medication administered. They're much less likely to have appropriate diagnostic testing done. And I think that probably most of the women of color who are your colleagues could tell you about experiences that, myself included, that we have all had in the healthcare system, and how challenging it is to navigate that, and how difficult it is to find a doctor who is affirming and inclusive. And then our last category is policing. At this point, we're all obviously aware of the sort of epidemic of police brutality, fatal police brutality against Black people. And there are more and more reports and statistics out there confirming what we already know, which is that Black people and people of color are much more likely to have an interaction with the police to begin with. They're much more likely to have multiple interactions with the police, and they're much more likely to have force, or at least threatened to have force used against them. And then that's also think like stop and frisk policing policy is a good example of that. So the ACLU did a study in New York over the last like couple of decades of summary of their stop and frisk policing, and in a year, roughly like 600,000 people were stopped and searched, and 87% of those who were searched were Black individuals. 87%, and in New York, roughly like 14% of the population is Black. So let that sink in. Next slide, please. So how do we contribute or collude in this? Implicit bias is certainly an example, right? So that sort of unconscious accepting or like agreement of stereotypes that have just been perpetuated forever that are certainly harmful to people of color. If you've never taken a Harvard implicit association test, I would encourage you to Google that and do so. There are multiple tests related to like multiple like race, gender, occupation, all of those things. And it's really interesting because I think you can think that you've done a lot of this work, and you can have done a lot of this work, and think that you've really checked a lot of your biases, and then take one of those tests and be like, whoa, I still have work to do. The saviorism mindset contributes to this. So as nonprofits, I think we certainly perpetuate this idea of paternalism, which is like the idea that that like our clients that we are serving are incapable, and that we as providers know what is best for them. And so we take action, quote, for their own good, but really we're sort of stripping them of their like autonomy and choice and liberty. And that is the way that nonprofits were really intended to be run, right? Like the roots of nonprofits and social work, like Jane Addams and the ladies of the Whole House were doing that intentionally. And maybe they were doing good work, and we are still doing good work, but we're still doing it within this system that is harmful and perpetuates holding down individuals who are in the minority. And then our last one is cultural norms and values expectations. So what are the things that we are sort of upholding in society as an acceptable cultural norm? And like, what are our values, and who is that excluding? So are we devaluing people based on how they dress, or how they wear their hair, or how they communicate, what language they're speaking, all of those sorts of things? What is seen as the norm and what is seen as other? And then even just like, what are the things in culture that we are celebrating, and what are the things that we are like not talking about? So like July 4th is a obvious example, right? Like that has been a holiday forever. And then we just got Juneteenth, and even now, okay, great, it is a federal holiday. How many of us really know what that is? How many of us have attended a celebration? Like what are we actually acknowledging there? Next slide, please. So what should we do? We need to educate ourselves and our staff. That's why I said I hope that we've all begun to do our own work around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and particularly racial inequities and how that shows up in the work that we do. We need to increase representation. How many of our agencies are staffed in a way that is representative of the people that we serve? And if you do feel like you're staffed in a way that is representative, what is that enough? What would happen if Black staff were overrepresented? So I think about like the incredible impact that it has on Black kids and kids of color to have teachers that look like them. But the next step is like, what if white students had people of color as their teachers? What would we be like teaching kids from a young age in terms of how they view people of color? So increasing representation. We also need to establish intentional policies, practices, and evaluations. I hope that we're all doing that at our agencies, but this is also a thing that I really hope we can come together and work on collaboratively to establish those policies as a COC. One that's not on here, but that I want to talk about is engaging in community and political advocacy. So for us to truly affect change in the work that we're doing, I think we need to be educated on our local policies around housing and homelessness. And then we need to go the next step further, and we need to be invested in doing that advocacy work in order to collaborate to see those harmful policies changed. And then we need to share power. So that is it from me, but we have some more information on racial equity and LGBTQIA+ population. So take it away.
Hi again. So the project applicant questions for the NOFO are being finalized, but we do want you to know that on the topics of racial equity and equity for folks of LGBTQIA experience, there will be more in-depth questions that are asked of you. Last year, we did sort of a checklist racial equity assessment to kind of get your creative juices flowing in terms of things that you might include in your programming, things that you might do at your organization to be more forward thinking and strategic in this way. And so now we're asking you to speak more in depth to the work that you're doing to advance equity in your programs. And so thinking about racism in terms of anti-Blackness, that's a term I think that really makes people's hair stand on end. It's quite a scary thing to talk about. Even as a person of color, I think that these topics really do evoke an emotion response, and that absolutely, in my opinion, is a necessary part of racial equity work. And so I think that, we tend to steer away from those things that are unpleasant or that cause us fear or anxiety for obvious reasons. And I feel like, if it isn't a little bit painful, if it isn't a little bit of a stretch or even a lot of a stretch to get into some of this stuff, you might not be having the right conversations when we're talking about racism, heterosexism, and all of the above. And so just be thinking, about for real, the historical legacy of racism and housing inequity as it pertains to our local community and the faces of the people that you see in our homeless population, and connect those dots, and then think about what it is that you might do to be part of the change. Next slide. So as far as LGBTQIA topics, this is a more robust kind of section in the NOFO this year. I think it's important to understand that all of the isms learn to harm people from racism. And so the same types of ways that we isolate or alienate people from access to resources based on their phenotype, based on their gender identity, sexual orientation, all of those things really do live in the same world and manifest to cause the same harm. So we know that just like people of color, members of the LGBTQIA community are discriminated against in all of the ways, and in ways that really diminish their own sense of purpose, value, in some instances, their ability to effectively matriculate at school or be successful in their careers. Especially when we're talking about folks of transgender experience, there's a lot of doorways that they are not safe and affirmed to walk through, and so they don't. And as a system that is designed to wrap around and support people, in most often their greatest hour of need, we honestly need to look at ourselves and figure out how to do our best to create a platform of safety and housing for people, to develop those trusting relationships and positive regard for folks, understanding that some of those experiences are the reason that they find themselves in a homeless situation. So knowing that discrimination is part and parcel to LGBTQ experience, we need to ground our work there, just like we would when we're talking about racism or any other ism. Like people of color, LGBTQIA individuals are also dramatically overrepresented in the homeless population. And once homeless, it is much more difficult for them to rebound. A lot of this has to do with the very limited shelter capacity that we have for folks that enables them to come into safety, so that we can help to support them and get them onto a housing journey. They are less likely to access critical life-saving support in both healthcare and housing, because in many instances, being sick or being outside is more desirable than being maltreated when you go to someone for help. These issues truly significantly impact the experience of young people. And I'm talking about young people all the way from 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old through the duration of their youth and young adult lives. So in HUD world, we typically talk about people between 18 and 24, but we know that all children and all youth of LGBTQ experience are grappling with a lot of these issues. And for many of them, their homes are simply not a safe place to be. There's a lot of young people, as indicated on this slide, and this data, there's a lot of data from Chapin Hall that was kind of the foundational, study on youth homelessness that really has driven a lot of the work over the last 8 or so years. But 26% of LGBTQ youth report being forced out of their homes because of their gender identity expression or sexual orientation. The interesting thing is when you look at people who are in their 60s and even 70s in homelessness, a lot of them started out as young people in homelessness, people that were in the foster care system 55 years ago, who are still, in this spiral of housing instability. And, LGBTQ people, we find a lot of folks that are out on the streets because they're not safe to, go seek shelter or get help. And so their homeless situation ends up being exacerbated because of those intersections of identity and systems that aren't well designed to suit their needs or to support their needs. And then when we talk about healthcare disparities, I think, being a person who's different in any sort of way is exhausting mentally, spiritually, physically, in all of the ways. Having to ask for people to affirm your safety, your humanity, that's tiresome. Being called names, being subject to violence, being excluded, all of those things are incredibly detrimental to a person's general well-being and certainly to their behavioral and physical health. And we know that mental health and physical health are inextricably linked, and that when people's mental health is impacted, so too is their physical health, and in some instances, their life expectancy. And so, I think that being at the intersection of being a person of color and being a person of LGBTQ experience puts a person at higher risk for certain health outcomes, for certain health conditions, and certainly for certain housing outcomes. And so we need to be mindful of those things as we're working with folks. Next slide. And again, as I mentioned, we are asking you to take a deeper dive when you respond to questions that have to do with equity. So really understanding the unique needs of these populations and understanding how the way that the world that we've created excludes them and discriminates against them. It's important that you know where we're starting from so that we can try to figure out where we're trying to get to. It does nobody any type of service if we choose to bury our heads in the sand on this issue, because there are simply too many Black people, too many brown people, and too many LGBTQ people who are relegated to living outdoors or in inhumane conditions. And in order for our system to be effective in serving them, we have to confront these challenges head on and be unequivocally honest with ourselves about what it is that we're doing and what we're not doing so that we can be more responsive to help people that desperately need our help. So asking ourselves about, the historical context, why things are the way that they are, and what it is that we're going to do as organizations and as a system to upend these systems that oppress and harm people. Next slide. So persons with lived experience and participatory planning, that continues to be a priority of HUD. And I think, to Evie's earlier point, that all of these things really do need to be foundational to the work that we're doing. They're not would be cool or would be nice type of things. In order for a homeless response system to be effective, you have to ask the people that are having homeless experiences what it is that they need, what it is that they value, what it is that they like, what it is that they want. And centering their voices in these conversations is the only way for us to really get to the heart of the issue and tailor a system that is responsive to those things. I put this quote from the National Council for the Homeless on here because I think it's just such a baseline expectation that we understand that bringing people in, alongside the rest of us to do this work is another way of affirming their humanity and valuing, what for them has most likely been an incredibly difficult experience. Utilizing them and their, profound expertise to simply do a better job than we're doing currently. So policies and programs should focus on lifting up those voices. And these are people who have either been or are currently having a homeless experience. Understanding that when you walk into an agency door, you need to see people that share your experiences and that mirror your demographics in order to know that, I'm not going to have unnecessary conversations with these people who don't understand a thing about me. The visual cue for me, for example, I grew up, in a single parent household, very poor. Going into a welfare agency and not seeing a single Black face would have been an incredibly daunting and intimidating experience. And in some instances, that people walk in the door, scan the room for safety, and if they don't feel safe, they pivot and bounce, and so knowing that staff at all levels, not just, the people that are at the reception desk, but people that are at the decision-making table, people that are administrators, people that prepare the meals, whatever it is, those folks need to mirror the folks that we're serving. Recognizing that people with lived experience of homelessness are the only true experts on homelessness. So the rest of, the world can theorize about what it's like or how awful it might be to be homeless or what might work to help people to end their homelessness, but they truly are the masters of their own destiny personally and the subject matter experts on the issue that we should be consulting at every turn. Meaningfully engaging them and participating in these things should be prioritized over things that tokenize them or minimize their experience. As a person of color with lived experience of homelessness myself, I'm often invited into conversations simply because of those things. And then I find myself to be the only one in the room. And I'm like, oh, so this is a checkbox type of scenario. That causes the person with that experience to feel unsafe and unwelcome. And it also minimizes and devalues, what for me was an incredibly difficult and continues, honestly, to be an incredibly difficult experience. And we're talking about doing this at all of the levels of planning, design, and implementation of our programs, as well as in leadership, thought partnership, and at the decision-making table. And then programs really do need to start thinking critically about not just, inviting former participants to do a thing so that they can get a free meal, trotting people out in front of the cameras to make it, appear as though we're doing the work at this level, but really truly appropriately compensating people for their expertise the same way you would any other subject matter expert or consultant in your organization. So just like you would pay a professional to come in and train your staff on case management, you need to pay people for the things that they've learned and the things that they've experienced. Rachel Erpelding, I think I saw one on the call.
Saw one of those.
There she is. There's one. Yep.
We
might
got
be
a little
here.
Rachel today. We caught you.
I got it, Amber. Thank you. Thank you, Markeia. I just want to say that considering what Evie and Markeia talked about in healthcare and the life expectancy of both people experiencing homelessness, but also who is overrepresented in our system and how that impacts the overall health of our system. We have been having those conversations in some of our committee meetings and just in experience of serving the people that are in need the most. We have identified this gap in healthcare and housing. And I have been a case manager in the past. I know that we focus on getting people into housing and getting their documents, and unless there is some emergency or crisis in somebody's medical health, we usually think, okay, let's get them stabilized and housed, and then we'll get a doctor and we'll do these kinds of things. But what we really want to move toward is our embedding those services into our homeless system. So when we bring people into that coordinated entry system, when we go to outreach people, when people are coming into the beehive and asking for help, we're able to provide healthcare services and give them immediate access. So we are providing them that necessary service all along the way. It's not something that they have to wait to do. Additionally, that on our last collaborative application, we didn't score terribly. Our score was actually pretty good. It just wasn't one of the top scores. And one of the areas that was identified that we could work on is that collaboration between healthcare and our housing system. It's not the main reason that we want people to focus on this, but if we do, then it improves our system performance as a whole and the services that we're providing people. And then our benefit as a system and in our collaborative application is just a bonus, but it's something that we want to look at as necessary to provide really good service and quality service to everyone in our system. When I talk about this, I know that a lot of people have questions and think, what does that look like? And wonder what in the world we're talking about and what collaboration looks like. There are some good examples of this. The Beehive and Care Beyond the Boulevard is one good example where they have people, dental and medical services embedded right in that outreach center. So what we are asking people to do as they go through this application and as they ask questions about their current programs and how their current programs could be better, we'd like people to ask how they could include healthcare services in their program. Are there agencies, and some of them are listed on the screen, but are there agencies that you could reach out to and you could say, hey, here are the people that we serve. These are the same people that you serve. How can we collaborate together so that we are benefiting the people we serve and both of our agencies? They're coming in here, they're coming into you. Let's make sure that we are giving them the best service possible. That can look like an MOU. It can look like a business agreement. And it can be something like a medical provider, an APRN going out on outreach. It can look like having a medical provider embedded in an office, or just having an office available one day a week for injections. But we need to focus on this because we know that people who experience homelessness die earlier. Homelessness just takes a toll on the body. And sometimes because people can hide it so well and get so used to all of the pains and the cricks and creaks and things that go on with their body, they just go on. I've seen people with pneumonia just going on about their day, not thinking anything of it because they don't think they feel too bad, and they really need care. The other thing that I've seen is people will then get housed, and after they get housed, they find out that they're really sick. They have cancer, and they pass earlier than we would like them to. And we want to get them the health care earlier than that. So we do have in our administration committee a subgroup that is working with the agencies listed here, and they have all expressed an interest in wanting to partner and serve our community. And if someone's not listed here, but you have a good relationship with someone, or you have a contact at a healthcare agency, reach out and ask. You don't know what's possible until you make the ask. And we are working in that healthcare committee kind of on a playbook for what services could be available, what an MOU might look like. But as you go through this NOFO process, and you might even find that you already have some services embedded that just aren't documented, or you do have a partner that's willing to collaborate with you. We ask that you reach out you can reach out to, I'm gonna just throw Amber under the bus, Amber or Markeia. You could reach out to even Kaylee, just to find out what an MOU might look like. I think that we'd all be happy to provide you examples. We did find out in our current system, I think we only have 4 MOUs or services that are documented. And don't get me wrong, it's not all about the MOU. It's about providing the service, making sure that that is embedded into our system and we are paying attention to it, and documenting the services that we might already be providing. So we can say, we are doing this. It's kind of like Sade was saying with HMIS, we can't know if you don't put it in there and you don't document it. So we want to know what's happening in agencies if you think you're already doing it. And we also want to help people reach out to agencies and try to establish those connections if possible. I think that's all I got. That's my slide.
Thank you, Rachel. We had a question at the in-person session yesterday, asking, when we're talking about healthcare, are we just talking about physical healthcare? Are we also talking about behavioral healthcare? And I just wanted to make that distinction if you could.
Yeah, I would, and I think that Amber or Markeia might maybe get some guidance on this, but I describe healthcare when we talk about any kind of healthcare. I include behavioral health in that, because what we're really working toward in like mental health and behavioral health services is parity, meaning your mental health and behavioral health treatment needs are treated exactly the same as your medical needs.
Thank you, Rachel, because I did answer that similar to what you said yesterday. So I'm glad we were on the same page. And KK, I think that was probably you in the chat. I completely agree with what you just said. So thank you, Rachel, for coming and presenting that slide. I echoed yesterday because I was presenting the slide that it has been energizing sitting around that table. This is not my area of expertise in any way, shape, or form. But I have been to these committee meetings just as staff and kind of listening and learning. And I will say that the WICO side is showing up and representing in full effect when it comes to this. So if we have any other organizations on the KCMO side or that we think could be really valuable, I think by next year's NOFA, there's going to be some kick butt, I'll be politically correct today, initiatives and things in place that are really going to be some game changers with the energy that I'm seeing right now. So Rachel, KK, both thank you for being a part of that group and helping spearhead that. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Perfect. And thank you. So we are going to, well, let's pause just for a second. Any questions before we really shift gears into talking about the NOFO process? Okay. So Markeia is going to come back and talk about the NOFO process. Again, please make sure you pay attention to this because all the good stuff, well, I mean, we've been talking about lots of good stuff, but as far as procedures, all of the stuff you really need to know is in this section. So listen, please.
Hi. Okay, so I'm going to run down the process for the NOFO. I might start talking really fast because I do want to be mindful of time and make sure that there's room for questions at the end. So I think the gist of this here is that the funding for the COC competition is a competitive process. It happens on an annual basis. We never actually know when the start date would be. It's a roving timeline. It's slated to happen sometime between May and August every year. And so We're in the midst of the process now, and it used to be called the NOFA, Notice of Funding Availability. It's now called the Notice of Funding Opportunity, or NOFO for short. So this year, our community is eligible for the following funds. So as renewal projects, these are projects that were funded in the last competition. We're eligible to ask for 15.7 million. Bonus projects are money that is in play. Now, mind you, none of this is guaranteed, but our community does have the ability to ask for close to $1.2 million for additional new projects of various types, and then another million plus for domestic violence bonus projects. So HUD funding is structured, HUD COC funding is structured in what's called a tier system. So 95% of that 15.7 million is in the top tier of our funding ask as a community. And then 5% of the renewal money, plus whatever additional bonus funds are available, would comprise our second tier. The reason that it's structured this way is so that we're able to identify to HUD our recommendations as a community for projects in tier 1, which are those that we deem that our system could not function without. And then in tier 2, those which would be really great if we had an addition, but that, things wouldn't come to a screeching halt if we didn't get that money. In the last couple of competitions, we haven't been able to access regular bonus funds. We've funded a new project, or perhaps two, through reallocating money from ourselves to fund something else. And then we did access additional funds in the form of a DV bonus in both of the last competitions. Next slide. Domestic violence bonus projects are funds that were earmarked by Congress to support individuals and families who are fleeing or experiencing interpersonal violence in all of its forms. If you are a person or an agency that's applying for these monies, please do revisit the definitions, as the definitions have been updated and amended to be more inclusive of a broader array of experiences. So this isn't just, moms with kids who are fleeing, a domestic partner. Interpersonal violence has a lot of different faces and manifests in a lot of different ways. So we're talking about stalking, trafficking, and also please do be mindful that people that are living on the streets overwhelmingly are having these experiences. And so this isn't just people that are currently housed that need somewhere safe to go, but people who are living on the streets who are enduring horrific violence in all of its forms. Next slide. So eligible costs of the COC funds. Now, I will be publishing for you in your applicant folder a very detailed list of eligible expenditures that you can make with your grant funds, as well as a template that you can utilize to build your budget. We created these tools so that you have, much more clarity around, how expansive the use of these funds could be. And, in particular, when we're talking about supportive services, Kaylee was, kind of hammering us over the head earlier about how important it is to have a robust service package in your programs for a variety of reasons. We know that organizations that are funded with supportive services either aren't asking for enough to be able to do this important work, or they've limited themselves, imposed constraints on themselves around the way that they can spend their money and aren't using the money to the greatest effect. So eligible costs include acquisition, rehab, and new construction. Those three application types are available to you. However, in order for us to fund those, we have to be able to fund a project in its entirety for 3 years within one funding cycle, which means that, as I mentioned before, there's roughly, $1.2 million, for example, that's available in bonus money. If we were to fund a project that asks for $350K for rehabilitation, for example, we would have to give them $350,000 times 3 in order to fund that in this cycle. And so typically acquisition, rehab, and new construction aren't prioritized as projects because they essentially gobble up all of the money that's available for new projects of any type in one NOFO. I'm not discouraging you from applying. I'm just saying that if you write such a proposal, make sure that it's super crisp and super powerful, because reviewers are less likely to want to give the entire chunk away. And certainly if the quality of the application doesn't pass muster, they're simply not going to do that. Leasing costs, rental assistance and supportive services, and then operating costs. If you're asking for operating costs, be very careful and read the regs about what that means and how it applies to your program. And then HMIS, oops, and that got cut off at the end. You're able to ask for line items that pertain to your use of the HMIS, whether that's staff time, computer technology, Wi-Fi, things that you need to be able to successfully participate in the HMIS. And then, as I mentioned, there will be a document in your folder that spells all of this out for you a little bit more. Next slide. So the NOFO application is comprised of two parts. And we wanted to spell this out for you because I think that there's some, confusion around what we mean by these different applications, and there's several formats. So as project applicants, you are required to submit two things. You have your local application, which is the questions that we write here in Kansas City. And you submit your responses to those in a platform called Zoom Grants. In addition, applicants are required to also submit an electronic application in a HUD created platform called eSnaps. So there's two forms of the application that you will submit. In addition, your eSnaps application, you will be required to export a PDF of that application and submit it in Zoom Grants. Now, all of this will be spelled out for you in your applicant instructions, but we want to make sure that you know that you have two things to do. If you are a renewal applicant, actually scratch that. I'm going to talk about that in a second. I don't want to get you guys confused. Just know that you have two applications that you have to do. Now, the Greater Kansas City Coalition staff, as well as partners out in the community that participate either on our NOFO committee or folks that we solicit information from, help to write what's called the community's consolidated application. So this is consolidated application. This is a mega application that speaks to the homeless work and activity across the community and across programs. So it's the jumbo app. And then your individual project applications are rolled up together and submitted in rank order according to our community's recommendations. So we roll all of that stuff up and send it off to HUD. And our organization as the collaborative applicant is the sole entity responsible for pushing send and sending that puppy off to HUD. Now, it's important to know that when we send our recommendations in the form of a tier listing to HUD, still none of this money is guaranteed. And so if we recommend your project and rank it in our tier system, and then HUD elects not to fund it for some other reason, that's a HUD decision. That's not a local decision. Our submission is merely our recommendations as a community. Next slide, please. Okay, so we've tried to consolidate this and err on the side of brevity, but there are a lot of steps here. So, to the person who asked about HMIS fees, stay tuned because there's more to come on that in the coming months. But at this particular moment in time, no, but that could change. So just stay tuned. Okay, so as far as the timeline goes, HUD releases an initial announcement that's obviously already happened. And then our committee gets together, reads the NOFO, just like all of you have done, I hope, and identifies anything within it that we need to prioritize, what questions we might need to fluff up or adjust or add to. We build out a timeline and start pumping out information to our membership by email and on our website as quickly as possible. The first big thing that comes out is the competition timeline. This year, there were a couple of TBDs on the timeline because we had to identify time for certain things that have to happen within a specified time frame per HUD, but so that we could also execute them locally. So the most recent iteration of the timeline, the most up-to-date one, was distributed by email on July 28th. If you don't have it in your email box, please check your spam, and check your spam often during the competition, because there's emails flying all over the place and we don't want you to lose critical information or have your application be kicked out because you missed a deadline. Always also check our GKCC NOFO tab on the website for up-to-date information to make sure that you have the latest and greatest. So then tomorrow, step 4 will happen, where you get your training materials distributed by email. We like to do that after the training so that people don't get too excited and try to go in Zoom grants and mess about when they haven't gotten the pertinent information that they need to submit a successful application. And so you'll receive those materials by the close of business tomorrow, as will the Zoom grants portal open by the close of business tomorrow. Pre-application letters of intent, those were already submitted in Zoom grants, and so really that step needs to go somewhere else in this timeline. Obviously, the mandatory applicant training, that's what we're doing right now. And then once we've done all of steps 1 through 7, then you go home, write a brilliant application in both eSnaps and Zoom grants and submit them. And then we start to go through your applications. You can go to the next slide, do our technical review and get those things ready and prep to send to our rank and review panel. The rank and review panel is a group of unbiased, unconflicted reviewers, many of whom are currently or recently have had a homeless experience. It's important, put a pin in that thought, because it's important that you know that people who have been in your programs are most likely reading your applications and scoring them. If your project does not meet threshold requirements, if there is a deficiency that can't be overcome, then it won't be sent to rank and review, and we will notify applicants prior to the rank and review panel sitting down that your application did not pass the threshold test, right? So this would be things like submitting a blank application. We've had that happen before. And these things are incredibly heartbreaking when it's something that obviously was a user error that could have been mitigated. So please double check your work and have other people double check to make sure that you're not, screwing the pooch here. Rank and review, they sit down and have a consensus meeting. So after having read and scored your applications, then they all come together to discuss them and build out their priorities on the tier structure. And so that all happens within an 8-hour, 9-hour day. And then there's time for them to revisit in the event that an application that wasn't selected seeks to appeal. If you did not get placed on the tier listing, if your project wasn't selected for ranking, then you will be notified by phone and email by GKCE staff. That actually means me. In both instances, I personally will be the one to call and email you to make sure that you're aware that this is happening. If staff do not have your most up-to-date information, please make sure that you are always keeping us informed of who your point people are on your team, so none of us are floundering, especially when we've got millions of dollars hanging in the balance. Their appeals are available for eligible reasons. You can't appeal simply because you're mad that you didn't get funded. There are very technical, and specific things that can be appealed. So do review the appeals policy on our policy page on the website if that's unclear to you. And then if an appeal comes through that is reasonable and eligible, then the rank and review panel will get back together, discuss and deliberate, and then make a final determination. Once all of this has happened, then there's a subcommittee of the board and the rank and review panel that meet to finalize things. Then the board votes on the finalized tier listing, and it's published on the website and via email. Okay. I know I'm talking a mile a minute, but I'm trying to make sure I don't overstep time boundaries. So In some instances, we might ask agencies that have submitted an application in eSnaps to go back in and revise their application because there is some technical deficiency that could potentially impact the whole community score. So this isn't, you know, for you to go back in and wordsmith your narrative and all that kind of stuff. It's if there's inconsistencies in your budget, your number of units, things that don't line up, those technical issues could affect our community score, and we simply don't want that to happen, obviously. If we ask you to do this, please stay on top of this situation, because once we've given your application back to you, we don't have it anymore. So even if we decided that it should be funded, if we ask you to update something and then you don't resubmit it by the deadline, your project won't get funding. And so that's really important. And then we publicly post our consolidated application, the tier listing, and all of the attachments on our website before we submit it to HUD for the final submission. And we give you a window of time to review it. If, you know, in the event that there's something that is egregiously out of place in the application, you have an opportunity to provide feedback. Next slide.
Really quickly, Markea, I'm going to read this question if we could answer it. Are the scoring rubrics and feedback available to agencies that reflect scores from the previous year's competition? Example, can we see feedback from previous years?
You muted yourself.
So when Markea is figuring out that, I'll answer part of this question that I answered in the chat. So here in just a second, we will go over some, oh, controls have disappeared. We will be going over some of the feedback that that the rank and review folks have shared with us. And then Markea just put yes, that I want to make sure I say this correctly, because I don't want to speak out of tongue about the scoring rubrics and making them available to people. Uno momento. And if you need a stretch, this is the time to stretch.
Forgive me, I have some folks that are messaging me a lot in the back, and the pop-ups made all my controls go away. So sorry.
You're totally fine.
So I don't know who asked the question, but we do submit feedback. If you were an applicant that received funds in the last competition, then your organization would have gotten written feedback, both about your specific project, as well as general feedback from the reviewers about the, you know, the quality of all of the applications. If you do not have that information, we can dig those out for you and resubmit to you. Okay, so I think we can move on, Keely. Okay, so things that you need to know to be ready for the competition. You need to submit a letter of intent to apply. I know that there is one applicant that had a technical issue with their LOI submission, so we can talk offline about that to figure out what went wrong there. Excuse me. You do need to have an eSnaps applicant profile. We do have the resources for where you access all of these things and figure out how to set them up. But in order to be able to do the submission in eSnaps, obviously, you need to have a user ID and password. The same is true of a unique entity identifier. HUD used to use your DUNS number to identify you as an agency, and now they require that you have something that is federally generated. You need to register for this at sam.gov before you apply for federal funds of any kind. You need to have a COC policy and procedure manual on file with HUD. There are instructions for how to do this on the HUD exchange. We'll give you additional insight there as well. However, I strongly recommend that if you are a new applicant, that you don't create a COC program policy and procedure manual from scratch. There are, hundreds of examples that are publicly available to you on HUD's webpage. And you most certainly can utilize one as a starting point and update it to include things that are relevant to your program. Match documentation. So on agency letterhead, now you can provide the match yourself, cash or in kind. However, if you have an agency partner that is giving you a cash or in-kind contribution, that needs to be on your agency partner's letterhead. And if it's an in-kind contribution from a third party, then you need to have an MOU. So you would put both of those documents together into one PDF and then submit them. Your agency code of conduct, that's something that you need to have on file locally. And then you also need to have a user ID and password for Zoom grants. And again, guidance for how to do that, how to set that up, will be provided in your applicant folder. For new projects, you need, and these look almost identical for new and renewal projects, but so you need your local new project application in Zoom grants, your eSNAPS project application in eSNAPS, your match documentation, your most recent agency audit. We don't need the entire audit. We just need the management letter or whatever format it is that indicates whether or not there were any material findings in your audit. And if there are findings, please don't panic and try to drum up some old audit that doesn't have findings. We need the most true and correct and recent one. And just because there's findings doesn't mean that, what you're doing is so egregious that you wouldn't get funded. If you have partnership agreements with healthcare, workforce, or housing entities for the local application, please also include that with your app, and those things will boost your score. And then any attachments, MOUs, match letters, any of those sorts of things, they need to be dated and executed between May 1st, 2023 and September 28th of 2023. So they need to coincide with the NOFO. We did have a question yesterday about a grantee that has an MOU in place, I think, with a healthcare entity, and they said that the MOU is executed every year on the calendar year. And so the date range wouldn't coincide with this. My guidance to them was to first reach out to HUD in the form of an AAQ to ask if they could have that agency partner write a letter to accompany the MOU, because HUD was very explicit within the NOFO that this is the date range for which you should have a signature on any of the attachments that you're submitting. Next slide. And this is just something that I like to impress upon folks if you're building out a new project, that, all of these kind of new and different things around racial equity, around LGBTQ topics, partnering with people with lived experience, and partnering with other mainstream benefits, services, housing resources, healthcare resources. Those things are newer requirements that are much more robust, but the bright light here is that you have the opportunity as a new project to build this stuff into your program from day one, where our older renewal projects that have been doing what they do for a very long time have had to fold these things in over time. And a lot of this is also about changing our narrative and reacculturating people, both staff and the folks receiving services, to a new way of doing things and a new way of thinking about things. And so as a new project, you have the ability from ground zero to build all of this stuff in. So you're at a strategic advantage there. Next slide. If you are a project that was funded in a previous competition and you have not yet run your program for an entire program year and submitted your annual performance report for that project, you will not be required to complete the Zoom grants application because your project is not eligible to be reallocated. And so it therefore is able to forego the local part of the competition. You do, however, have to submit your project in eSnaps. That is a requirement of HUD for you to get any funding at all. The reason for this is because brand new projects would not necessarily have had the opportunity to mature and really get going so that we know that what they're doing is effective. And so if we were going to reallocate projects before they had the opportunity to demonstrate what they can do, then we probably shouldn't have funded them in the first place. So until your program is operated for a full year and submitted its final performance report, it does not have to participate in that phase 1 of the competition and only has to submit in eSnaps. Processes that could happen during the competition are consolidation, transition, expansion, and reallocation. Consolidation is where you take 2 or more previously funded renewal projects and combine them into one. Doing so requires that you write 3 eSnaps applications, as well as 3 local applications. And that sounds really terrifying. However, you're imposing administrative burden on yourself now so that later on you have less work to do in the future. You don't have to do 3 performance reports. You don't have to have 3 separate projects in HMIS. You don't have to continue writing 2 applications in the NOFO competition each year. And so, yes, you are doing a bunch of work at the front end to roll these programs together, but then in the long run, it's easier both for yourself and for our staff to manage those programs if you roll them together. Transitioning is taking a program of one type and turning it into something else. And so, for example, if you have a rapid rehousing program and you identify that, yeah, this program was, you know, super nifty when we funded it, but now we're seeing that the population has shifted or the needs have changed and we really need to transition this to a permanent supportive housing program, then you have the opportunity to do that within the NOFO. Expansions are when you have an existing renewal project and you want to ask for additional funds to do more of something. So you might have a standalone permanent supportive housing program that serves 10 people, for example, and you'd like to ask for additional funds to serve 5 more people for a total of 15. So in that instance, you would write 2 applications to ask for those additional funds. Now, just because, let me say this differently. If the reviewers like your new project, but don't like your renewal project, then neither one of them will get funded. And I say that because this is a blind review on the reviewer's part. So they have no idea which projects they're evaluating. They're looking at all of them in isolation and separately. They will know that both projects are connected to an expansion, but they won't necessarily know that they belong together. And so in order for the new project to get funded, the renewal project has to also be selected for funding. So numbers 1, 2, and 3 are things that the applicant does. Number 4 is something that the collaborative applicant can do. So reallocating would be taking funds from one program to then fund something else. And this happens with the recommendations of the rank and review committee. So if they look at a project and they're like, well, this project says that it's going to serve 100 people, but it's only serving 25. You know, they're not operating at capacity. And so we're going to pull some money from over here to fund this new project that we think might fill a gap in the community. Next slide. For renewal applicants, the only thing that differs from the new applicants is that we ask for a final ELOCS drawdown report from the last grant that you closed out. So we want to know, we're going to ask you in your application, but we also want to see the documentation of exactly how much of your grant you spent down at closing. And this is important because we're really looking at utilization of our COC funds. We've gotten some spending reports from HUD that were pretty terrifying, especially during COVID time. We know that obviously it was more difficult to do this work during COVID. There weren't a lot of housing resources, staffing shortages were an issue. But we have had over the last several years, applicants who have left a significant enough amount of money on the table that this is a performance metric that we need to be looking at more rigorously in our scoring of applications and our selection of projects, because, you know, if we're leaving a lot of money on the table, that's money that could be helping our community that then simply gets rolled back to the feds, and we have no idea what becomes of those funds, but we know that we have people sleeping outside, and so we shouldn't be sending any money back. Next slide. Sade, I'm gonna give it over to you to talk about these performance metrics.
Okay. So I know previously we talked about entering the information into HMIS, and it's important to know that a portion of the rank and review are going to be called scorecards. And this is where you will be scored on the information that you put into HMIS. So when you pull that information out of HMIS, you'll run a APR. So when you have access to our HMIS system, you will have access to pull your APR at any time. We encourage organizations and agencies to pull this on a monthly basis to check and see. And what's basically this is a roster of all your clients and any HUD assessment questions that you have asked. So where did they come from your program? What is their enrollment date? Do they have health insurance? All of this information is very important that you answer it as it is in the file that you have, and you answer it correctly, because you will be scored on it in the scorecards. So the metrics that we'll score on are data quality of exit destinations. So you want to make sure that you're putting that information in a timely manner and that it's also correct. So personally identifiable information. So this is going to be social security number, their date of birth, just any information you may have. We do understand there are some instances where you may not have this information, but we encourage you to try to collect as much as possible. So minimum percent to move to permanent housing, average participant days spent to move housing move-in. We have a lot of training around when to enter a housing move-in date, when the enrollment date should be entered, when the exit date should be entered. This is different for a lot of programs, and sometimes we get a lot of questions on when exactly these dates should be entered. So we do provide a lot of training before you have access to the system on where and when those dates should be entered in the system in HMIS. So we're also looking at the length of time in the project. This will still pull from those dates. So increased income for leavers and stayers. The number of participants that entered from place not meant for human habitation and exited, the number with a disability, and the number who entered and exited with zero income and their chronically homeless status. There are going to be a few more metrics that we are looking to add just so that we can track our returns to homelessness, because while we are all very excited that our clients exit to permanent housing, we still want to make sure that they remain permanently housed. So we are looking at that to make sure that we're doing our due diligence and looking at all of our eligible costs and seeing exactly what we can do to make sure that our clients are staying housed. And then we're also looking at the length of time from referral to house. This is very important. I actually wrote this down so I wouldn't forget. When we're talking about the capacity to administer your program or your project, you really want to make sure that you have enough case managers on site to be able to effectively run your program. So if you're saying like, well, we can't house someone because we don't have enough staff, but you've asked for all these referrals, that's an issue. So we are looking at the number of referrals you have accepted and how long it actually took you to get that person housed. So I would consider that when writing the application to see, okay, this is how many case managers I have. Ideally, this is how long it may take to house someone, and this is what we can take on. So just making sure that you understand that we are looking at this information in HMIS. We've had the question a lot, like, oh, you really look at that? We really do. We really want you to put that information in correctly and make sure that you're entering it in a timely manner, so that when we pull these scorecards, that we're getting accurate information. And we wanted to make sure you have this so you know that these are the things that we're looking at. And we do have a guidance sheet that lets you know exactly where these will be pulling from your APR so that you can run your APR on a quarterly basis or a monthly basis yourself and kind of see where you are before we even pull these. We do pull them and then give you time to kind of clean them up, ask any questions, and then we pull them again and they are used in the rank and review.
Thank you, Sade. I'm going to skip over this question because we'll have room right after resources for questions.
Okie doke. So tomorrow you will receive a link to a Dropbox folder that will have a bunch of stuff in it for you to be able to successfully participate in the competition. So the COC NOFO packet, which is the document that HUD releases once the competition begins, is my strong hope that you have already reviewed this document from cover to cover. As riveting of a read as it is, it's really important that you know the requirements of what it is that you're applying for and read that from nose to tail. The 2023 competition timeline, the most up-to-date version of this. I do have a list of racial equity resources that we've found to be useful for applicants as they're thinking about, you know, how they might respond to questions within the NOFO, but then also things that they might try in their programs. The list of eligible program costs and budget template that I referenced earlier. The newest iteration of the Federal Strategic Plan. This is a document that's created on a semi-regular basis by the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. This is like a federal think tank of representatives from, I don't know, it's something like 14 different departments within the federal government that in some way touch on homelessness issues. So they've drafted a federal strategic plan that's called All In. It speaks to the state of homelessness now, during and in the wake of the pandemic. It talks a lot about the various federal resources that came into communities during COVID-19 and kind of what the way forward is. So this framework is what HUD and all of the other federal agencies use as their roadmap on homelessness, and thus it's the thing that drives all of the applications and application processes that we undertake. So being familiar with that, you'll be familiar with what's hip and now in homelessness work from the federal perspective. You'll receive new project and renewal project detailed application instructions. Those are to accompany the work that you'll have to do in eSNAPs. We have a locally created glossary of terms and acronyms. There's a lot of terminology, a lot of industry jargon, and especially acronyms that we use in this work. And so if you're new, you certainly want to at least skim the acronyms so that you're not lost in the sauce when we're having these conversations. You'll get a copy of this training slide deck, as well as a link to the recording from today's session, and then instructional guidance from Zoom grants, so that you're able to successfully set up your Zoom grants user ID and password, and the same is true of eSNAPs. I have a list of other resources that will include, and you'll see that in just a sec. So this is something that we've begun to introduce in the unsheltered NOFO competition last year, but we felt like pro tips for grant writers is never a bad thing. And the industry standards around this stuff does, they do change and evolve over time. But so we wanted to give this to you as a resource. So the most important thing I think is that you want to be clear in your writing and be honest and authentic in your responses. So writing a tight project narrative that is one complete thought that has clear details when things align within your application, your budget, and so on, and that you are honest and authentic about what it is that you're doing. So being able to clearly explain the need for the project is critical. Differentiating yourself from others in the space. Targeting a very specific project in your proposal. We've gotten proposals that, all of it sounds great, but none of it really seems to live in the same world. And if it's confusing for the reviewers to read your application, the likelihood of it getting funded is pretty nil. Really do try to stay away from fancy language as well as a bunch of jargon, acronyms, industry words. You have a lot of people with lived experience reviewing your applications, but also when the language gets too poetic or too flowery, you know, they say, then reviewers start to think maybe, you know, this isn't real world stuff, and maybe they're being more imaginative than practical. But with that said, you also need to be a good storyteller. I think one of the things that gets forgotten is that we are actually serving human beings who have very complex and interesting lives. And so it is important to be able to characterize those things in your application and tell the reviewers about you, about your program, and about the people that you serve within your program. So you want to keep it high level enough that it's focused and tight, but then also humanize it with a great story. Focusing on solutions and not problems is a really important one. So this is something that we talk about a lot in the work that we do with clients, but we forget to do it in our own administrative work. It is much more inspired for folks to hear that, yes, we acknowledge that there's an issue, and here's what we intend to do to address the issue. In nonprofit, you know, we're always in scarcity mode and, you know, begging for money and whatnot. And so we want everyone to know how rough and how terrible everything is. But when you're writing an application for a grant reviewer, they want to see an inspired and enlightened point of view and not solely focusing on problems. Absolutely make sure that your budget makes sense and that it coincides with what you wrote in your narrative. That's a technical issue that comes up a lot. And I think it's because oftentimes the brain that wrote the budget and the brain that wrote the project narrative aren't necessarily inside of the same person, and they're not having conversations. I highly recommend when you sit down, especially to write a new project, but really to write any project, that you rally your team. Also, don't just ask the people that sit upstairs in the fancy offices. Talk to the people that are actually administering the program, that are working directly with your guests and program participants, and ask them what they think about those questions and get their insight. Even if they aren't amazing writers, they need to be involved in this process to keep your application grounded in the real world, and so that it makes sense to what it is that you said you were going to do. So getting your team together to have a brainstorming session and kind of work through the application, in my mind, is a best practice, and to make sure that whatever you put in your budget, whatever you put in various parts of your narrative, that all of that is congruent and that it makes sense. Recruit an objective reviewer. I often say to get a person that absolutely has nothing to do with the work that you do, so that you can they can read your application and make sure that if it's easily understood by them, it will easily be understood by any person. And I often recommend that you have a person who's younger in age or inexperienced to read it. So for example, having your 14-year-old nephew read your application, if they read it and they're like, I have no idea what you're talking about, or I don't understand any of those words, then you might want to dial it back a little bit to make sure that, yes, you want to teach the reviewer something, but they don't want to be learning as if they're in an academic setting. And if they're having to look up things, they start to get really bored and confused by the application. Don't procrastinate. Please don't turn in sloppy work that is rushed. We recognize that, you know, it's a short window of time that you have to do all of this, but really it's important that you put forth quality work to get a quality outcome. And then pay close attention to details. You know, make sure that there's uniformity of voice in your writing, and that you certainly do this in a collaborative way, but your work needs to be cohesive. And it is important that you check for spelling errors, grammatical mistakes, and those sorts of things. Don't submit unnecessary attachments. We're not going to read them. If it's not on the list of things that we're asking for, we simply don't have time, and the reviewers aren't looking at this stuff anyway, because this is a blind review process. So all of the fancy logos and brochures and all of that kind of stuff doesn't actually help your cause. And then in your writing, please do not overwhelmingly use your agency name in every single sentence, because people have to go in and redact all of that information. We know from, you know, your applicant profile who you are. And so it simply makes unnecessary and overly burdensome work for the reviewers that have to scrub all of that information out. And then next we have local tips from our reviewers. So this is people that have read the applications over time and the type of feedback that they give. Center the client and not the program. So, you know, a lot of times we find that folks are talking about the successes of their agency or how wonderful they are, and they completely miss the point of talking about the person that is supposed to be centered in the conversation. Again, funding requests and the staff time or FTEs that you ask for should make sense. So budget and narrative need to live in the same universe. Remember that people with lived experience of homelessness are reviewing your application. They are incredibly astute and insightful, and many of them have been through many of your programs. And so even though it's a blind review, it's really uncanny how frequently they recognize the programs because they've lived there or they know the people there. They also can smell inauthenticity. People that have been homeless are incredibly good judges of character because they have to be. And so, you know, their truth meter is a lot more fine-tuned than most of ours, and be mindful of that. Consistency is important. So, you know, making sure the application is a complete thought. Your project should serve the whole community and geography. Copy pasting is a no-no. This is something that I know that most agencies, especially those that do a bunch of grant writing, have boilerplate type of templates and things that they use. Even if you do, please retype it into the platforms. And I say this because copy paste errors where you have things that don't line up, where you're talking about your 2019 project and it's 2023, all of that kind of stuff raises extreme red flags, and it's careless. And it's one of those things that, you know, your attention to detail, you know, it really reflects on that. Being specific and not using what's called hand wavy responses. So, you know, the racial equity question, oh yeah, we do racial equity, or LGBTQ, oh yeah, we take gay people. Like, that's not what they're looking for. They want authentic responses that aren't just kind of like you're phoning it in or just checking a box. If you provide data in your response, use good, relevant, and, you know, time relevant data. So it needs to be current, and cite your sources. Don't just make stuff up or pull things off a wiki wherever and stick it in there and then you don't tell us where it came from. The fancy and academic language and being a complete thought, the making sure to answer all of the questions. Don't skip or leave questions blank. If for some reason you are skipping a question, type NA in the box so that we know that that was deliberate and that you weren't just rushing through it. And then the last one, this is one of the ones that just really works their absolute nerves, and it's probably due to copy pasting. But if you run out of space, if you exceed the character limit on a response, don't just, I give up, I'm just gonna go lay down, you know. This, I think, is more a copy pasting error than people just being straight up lazy. But if you copy paste something and then stick it in the box and it doesn't fit, and then you don't go back and look to make sure, you're only submitting half of your response and you won't get the points. And then the thing that they've said about racial equity, and obviously this applies to equity in all of its forms, is that the reviewers want to really hear authentically what it is that you're doing and what efforts you're making. They don't want, you know, fanfare. They don't want, you know, we're pretending to do all these things that aren't real. They don't expect anybody to be perfect. For a lot of folks, they're just dipping their toe into the water of really doing equity work. And so it is absolutely okay. It's even desired that you share with them what's working and what's not working. We had an applicant, I think it was last year, who, when they were talking about LGBTQ topics, they did a fantastic job in saying, we're not good at this, and this is new for us, and we're really trying. The reviewers were over the moon that for once in our life, somebody is being honest that they don't know and that they're learning, you know, and that goes for anything that you discuss in your applications. Yes, you want to showcase your program and how nifty it is. I've said nifty twice in one day, you guys. I'm getting old. You want to showcase your program and how great it is. but it's also important to let people know that, yes, we haven't figured all of this out. Yes, we've tried things that were terrible and we don't want to do them anymore. All of those things really humanize the issue. And, it reeks of authenticity when you're being vulnerable and truthful that you don't have it all figured out.
Mark, I know this is the local, can you go back real quick? I know this is the local review feedback, but can you kind of touch base a little more on number 5? I know that some issues we've had in the past are agencies stating like they'll help their community, like that they're placed in, like just around them. And I know that has been an issue before.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of back and forth dialogue about, because we are a bi-state continuum of care, what it means to, operate in a COC that straddles a state line. What we are asking is that, to the extent that it is possible with your program as written, if you are a renewal applicant in particular, we are seeking programs that serve the whole community and its entire geography, right? And so I don't want to get too far down a rabbit hole with this, because we have a couple of programs that have their own specifics because of where they're geographically located. But we are a bi-state continuum of care. And so it is our greatest wish and desire, in order for us to be equitably serving everyone in the community that needs help, that we stand up projects that have the capacity to serve the entire continuum of care. Okay. And so in particular, if you are a new project applicant, be mindful of that we are a bi-state COC. Our geographic boundaries being what they are can impose challenges, but there is no challenge that's so great that can't be overcome. And, the state line is a street like any other street in Kansas City. And, when I first got to Casey, I'd never seen anything like that, where you literally cross the street and you're in another state, and so we're not talking about driving 100 miles to get somewhere to visit with clients. We're talking about driving 5 miles, and so just be very mindful of that we are a bi-state COC. We have an enormous need on both sides of the continuum, and that we need to be as effective and efficient and good stewards of our resources as possible to make sure that everybody in our local community that needs us has access. Okay, so then you will have links to these resources. The HUD Exchange is the go-to place for all things HUD. The Facebook Hub, don't sleep on the Facebook Hub. This is a really great resource, especially, I was talking about this yesterday, when you have lingering questions in the middle of the night about the NOFO or about coordinated entry or whatever. There are many, many other people nationwide. There's, 400 and some odd COCs across the nation. A lot of those people are on this Facebook group. And in many instances, they've had the same questions or have gone to HUD to get the technical guidance to answer their questions. And so if there's something that you don't know, that is a good resource to leverage, because there is a lot of collective wisdom around this issue and how to run these programs. And if you need things like, hey, does anybody have a coordinated entry policy guide they want to share with me? Or does anybody have, a confidentiality policy? People are incredibly forthcoming and generous with their time and with these resources that they've created. And so do use it. The data dashboard on our website, the COC interim rule, we'll put a copy of that in your stuff. The eSNAPS toolkit, as I mentioned, and then those racial equity resources that we will include in your application folder.
All right. That is it for the information we're presenting to you. I want to open the floor. It looks like we have about 7 minutes to ask any questions that you may have. Go ahead, Desiree.
Hey, I have a bunch. I might need to email some of them.
Okay.
On the 25% match, can that be matched with staff time for otherwise eligible expenses that are supported with other funding and other grants, or like just our own cash?
Yes, that would be it would, I guess you described both in-kind and cash contributions. So yes, it can be. But make sure, if it's another federal source, that it's a federal source that is eligible to be used as match, and those are pretty few and far in between. So yes,
Yeah,
if
it
it's
would-
cash. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, it wouldn't be federal for us, but sorry, you go ahead.
Yeah, so it can be it's some money that you have in-house or staff or whatever resource that's funded with by some other means that can be used as an in-kind contribution, and you would document that and then submit a letter to that effect on your own agency's letterhead with whomever is in charge with their signature on it.
And then I saw at the beginning, and I'll email some of my questions so I don't dominate the time. This will be my last one for now. At the beginning, there was a thing that said that we could do supportive services -CE. Can you tell me what does that mean?
Those SSO projects are projects that are not housing based. They are service only projects. And in this instance, service only projects that are designed to increase the capacity and flow of the coordinated entry system. So if you were to opt to apply for an SSO project, you would be writing for a project that would serve any person in the COC that needed access to coordinated entry services.
From the by name list.
Yes, from the by name list and or through our street outreach efforts.
So anybody on there that might need coordinated entry help would come through us if we did an SSO only.
Yeah. Oh, and you're with Children's Mercy. Yeah. So I think Austin and I have talked about this at great length and kind of what this could look like. I think it might be good if you scheduled a brief call with either Amber or Kaylee just to kind of give them a rundown of what you're thinking about, because you have a niche population to a certain degree. However, many of our families access help of various kinds through Children's Mercy. And so there's a really great tie-in there with the organizations that work with families. But I think it would be good just to kind of wrap your head around what all this means if you sit down with staff and just chat about it. And then Miriam says, scorecards. No, Miriam, you will have a window of time for you to review. And then if there's anything that's, you know, all the way out of pocket on your data, you have time to clean up, and then you'll get a second scorecard, which will be your final. So for now, there's nothing to be done.
Other questions? Desiree.
Thanks, Ki-
Oh, sorry. I was gonna say, Desiree, do you have any others that you want to ask, since we do have a little more time?
Sure, I'll keep going.
Okay.
If we have a new project that comes out of the bonus line that we saw, is that right?
Correct.
bonus or reallocation in the event that they read your project and they say, this is the bee's knees, where we have to find the money to fund this project. It's possible if they're considering reallocating from somewhere else that they might take money from somewhere to give money to a new program. So it can be reallocation or bonus money.
And then do you all, so as a new applicant, completely new applicant, do you all need to support our application to get into eSNAPs, or is that something we can do on our own?
You do it on your own.
Okay.
And yeah, and there's technical guidance for how to do it. eSNAPs is a pretty archaic and clunky system. And so I would suggest messing with it a little bit before you get in there to actually write your application, so that you don't feel the need to rip your hair out while you're doing it if you've never used it before. And then the other tip I will tell you for eSNAPs is there's a character limit for every single text field. I would do my writing in Word or Google Docs or somewhere where you can count before you submit it into eSNAPs, because the windows for your text look like razor thin, and it's really hard to scroll and to edit in there. And so if you're way over, you'll be nothing but frustrated if you try to slim it down inside the platform.
I echo that. And I know Amber does too.
I've used eSnaps for a different continuum of care.
Okay, so you know
But-
all about
But
it.
I've never had to start with a fresh instance. Does that make sense? So that's where I'm a little.
Yeah. Yeah, as long as you use something that gives you a character count outside of it, you should be fine.
All right.
And I'll email you, Kaylee and Amber, and I'd love to meet with you, Amber. It's been a while.
Yeah, Desiree, if you wanna just shoot me and Kaylee an email, do you have Kaylee's email? Okay, perfect. It was good seeing you again, yes.
All right, well, thank you all again for attending this mandatory meeting. Not that you had an option, but thank you anyways. And we really do, we wish you the best of luck through this process, and reach out if you have any questions at all. Thank
When
you.
we only lost 4 people, so not too shabby.
And that's been within the last like 10-15 minutes because I checked, so we're good.
Awesome.
Well, and one of them was Evie, so she didn't count. Well, she
Yeah.
counts, but she didn't count.
Got you.
All right, bye everyone.
Bye, guys. Thank you for
you.
coming.